Here is an image that many of you will be familiar with, or something very much like it. Those living statues that we see all over the world in major cities, and what a way to earn a living. I've created some successful pictures using these figures before, but rarely do I use them just as they are. This guy was on the south bank of the River Thames in London, close to the London Eye. I did shoot quite a few images of this guy, and I actually used them in an audio-visual called London Calling. But here I'd like to remove him from that fussy background. As you can see to the right of the man, I've got a couple of other shots that I've sorted out of the structure of one of the London bridges. Now, I don't think either of these images have enough going for them on their own, but perhaps they do if we amalgamate them together and also give them that monochrome impact. So one of our first tasks here is to remove this guy from the background, and it's where I want to start. Sometimes if I want to make a cutout, I will use the camera raw options to help me. Working with a smart object, we can make a cutout and still have access to our raw image. So if we have an image where we can enhance the contrast to make a selection easier, then we can do so. Here, when I try to push up the colour of the gentleman in question, it pushes up the background colour too. So perhaps I'll come at this in a slightly different way. Now, I've never used this guy or the background image before, so this really is a live demonstration in the sense that it could all go terribly wrong. I'm sure we'll do our best to avoid that, but when you start creative manipulations as we are here, we're never entirely sure. So let's make a start. What I'm going to do to make a start here is my usual place to go, which is the lens correction to remove chromatic aberration. I was saying a few moments ago that sometimes I use camera raw to adjust an image to a degree that sometimes it looks quite horrible, but it may help with the cutout. I'm not sure it will here, but you get the idea. If, for example, the guy had a specific colour that was isolated from the background, we could push up the vibrance and even the saturation, and it may make him stand out. Doesn't do a great deal for the picture, but of course we're working with a smart object here, so we could treat this little manipulation here as just something temporary. Tell you what, why don't we do that, and we'll come back and make the adjustments to monochrome a little bit later. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to just open this straight up into Photoshop. Over the years, I've demonstrated a number of different ways to make a selection or to create a cutout, and there's no right and wrong way really. Just find something that suits you and one that gives you a good result. It's the result that counts. But I've used the layer mask method with the shift click with the brush, so let's use something a little different here. I'm going to use this option here, but to start with I'm just going to pick up my zoom. I just want to zoom into the guy. I want him bigger on screen, but I don't want him enormously large because I want to see how the brush works as we go along. So I'm going to select the quick selection tool. I'm going to use this tool straight out of the box, so to speak. I've just increased the size of the brush very slightly using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. At the top of the screen we've got the basic selection, we've got the little plus here added, so we're going to add one selection to another. But we can remove a selection as well if things don't go according to plan. So let's make a start just on the guy's head, and you can see how this tool makes things pretty quick to do, to start with at least. And I'm just brushing into these areas. You can see the little plus alongside it, and perhaps the colour that I've enhanced into the guy has helped a little bit. I'm just brushing down the left and up to the hand, all looking good so far. Just keeping our eye. Now it's suddenly jumped across to, let me tidy up that little bit there, and it's jumped across to there, so it's got a bit of difficulty there. So I could go up to the top left of the screen and choose the minus option, but I do get the opportunity to just touch the Alt key. So I wonder if I can just touch the Alt key and tease that selection back, and I don't think that's too bad. Still got the Alt key selected, and we've even got a little bit there. Well, let's hit Control 0. We've got the basis of our selection made, but we need to have a look around the edge very carefully, because in some places it's going to be fine, in others not so much. And if you look at the guy's nose and to his right eye, you can see we've missed quite a bit there. Now, if you're going to commit any sort of time at all into a selection, it makes sense to me to go to your select menu and to save it as you go. So let's just call this the Gold Man, although he's going to turn silver when we take the colour away. And you can see by default I've got a new channel selected. I'm going to click OK. Now we can zoom in to his head and we'll take a look in much more detail. Now we can take a look around the options around the edge here. Now I'm going to make my brush much smaller. I've got a little bit there. Can I get that to be picked up? I like to add these little bits of detail because I think they make a difference between a selection and a cutout being believable than not. And there you can see by just teasing that out, that's worked quite well. Now I can move down this side. I think I'm going to have a bit of trouble here because I think as I go into these areas it may jump, maybe not. I was going to say I thought it was going to jump something like that. No problem with that. We can either hit the Alt key, switch to the minus and tease it back. But there are times when we've got something like this where it's probably quicker to just pick up another tool. So if I picked up the polygonal lasso tool, for example, and I checked this little box, which is add one selection to another, I could go in a little bit closer. I can start my selection there, move to the edge of his glasses, click, 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 and you can see I can go around the edge here much more carefully. Whoops, I've missed the side of his face then. I should have gone that way. So going down his right cheek to that sort of point, and now if I go around the outer edge I can just gather all of that up. To remove these other little bits, this bit here, we can just gather that up straight away. This one needs to be removed from a selection, so once again you can either hit the Alt key and you can see the plus on the tool turns to a minus, or you can select the icon at the top of the screen. You can see it changing as I touch the key. So here I could quickly take away that little patch, and of course little details like this. I start over here rather than within the selection because sometimes it's easier to see where we started from when we want to join up. But there we have the head done, and all I'm going to do now is to work around the outside, looking very carefully at my selection. I'm going to move back here to my quick selection in plus mode. I'll make the brush smaller, but I'd like to pick it up and make this selection really nice. And there you can see I can gather that up. In some places, if it falls a little short of the line, you can make a judgment, because sometimes when we're looking at a selection, we need to actually contract the selection a little bit to get around that problem of sometimes taking a halo with us when we make a cutout. Here we've got a little bit of a deficiency, but you can see the brush does help me out. Maybe I've gone a bit too far that side, but we're going to be putting a layer mask on this selection, or we're going to use a selection to create a layer mask. So although I'm being careful here, to be honest, I've got my belt and braces firmly on with this manipulation, because when I add the layer mask, of course, that's infinitely changeable even once we've made the cutout. Now, although I've built this as a live demonstration, I'm sure you don't want me to let you watch me go around the entire outer edge of this guy as I just tidy up the selection, but you can see exactly what I'm doing. But don't get too fretful with this, because as I've said, we're going to be making a layer mask, so we can quite easily have our cake and eat it. I'm going to go around the outer edge of this to make sure it's more or less where I want it, and I'll be back very shortly. Now, although for you I seem to be back with my finished selection almost instantly, I don't think it took me more than 3 minutes just to work through or around the edge of the rest of the guy, because most of it picked up pretty well. So I had to do just a little bit of work around the right hand side, but nothing different to what we did on the left. So if you look at the timer on this video at this point, here we've had quite a lengthy introduction and we've made a selection. Add 3 minutes onto that and you've got the time taken to really cut this guy out. Not a great deal of time, and I think we've got a good quality selection there. So let me top up that save selection that I saved a little while ago by going to my select menu, choosing to save a selection. When I go to this drop down option and select my gold man, all of the other options open up to me. So I can effectively replace the channel, which means really add my final selection to the one I first saved, which is the one we're going to choose, but we could make them separate selections in their own right, and I'm sure there are some projects which wouldn't need that, but here we can just click OK. So we've got our selection now safely stored with this image. So it also makes sense, before we go any further, to save this as a project, saving it as a Photoshop file. Remember, I opened this up as a smart object. Well, I may not have said that in Camera Raw, but I did. So what we've got to do now is to take this back into Camera Raw and change the guy into monochrome. We can do that now, or we can finish the cutout and then open it up. Let's finish the cutout and we'll open him up when we're done. First of all, the selection's on the man and we want to get rid of the background. So what I could do is inverse that selection. Control-Shift-I is the shortcut key, but remember, with selections, if you want to do anything, well, go to the select menu. There's the one we want, inverse. So now, instead of having the man selected, we've got everything but the man selected. Now we're going to be creating a fairly aggressive monochrome image here, so perhaps what I'm about to say is not entirely relevant to what we're going to do here, but it may be if you're doing the same thing in colour. A lot of the problem with cutouts is people take them from one image to another and leave telltale signs, and one of those telltale signs is when we make a selection isn't actually a sharp edge, and if we cut it out too sharp, then the first thing we're going to do is to make our cutout look unrealistic. But if we feather it too much, what we can sometimes do is take a little bit of a halo with the guy. So if the guy was standing against a very light or dark background, we may take some pixels with him in those various tones. We're going to be placing him against a bridge which is quite complex in shape, so it's going to hide a multitude of sins, but we should still make sure our selection is as perfect as we can get it. So here's a little tip that I've used for many years. I'm going to go to my select menu, I'm going to go to modify, and I'm going to choose expand. I'm going to expand my selection 2 pixels into the man. So although I've made a careful selection, I'm just going to make it jump in just a little bit. Now no one's going to notice the loss of 2 pixels. It's minute on a 20 million pixel image. So I'm going to click OK to that, and you can't even see anything unless I was zoomed in. But all I've done is I've helped not take a halo with this guy should we be making an image in colour perhaps, or in different circumstances where we're putting a subject against a different background. Now we need to soften that selection just a little bit, and now we have select and mask. We can look at the select and mask in a number of ways, I tend to standardize most of the time on black and white, but this isn't going to change what we do. It's just a different way of looking at things. In the feather, I probably wouldn't want to take more than about 1 pixel, maybe 2 maximum, and all it does is just soften this line a little bit to make it more believable. And I'm going to output this to a selection. I could have chosen to go straight to a layer mask, but we'll add that manually here. So we've made the selection, tidied it up, inversed it, we've made it contract just a couple of pixels to try to eliminate any problems of a halo. We've softened the edge. Now we can add the mask. The mask will recognize that the selection is in place and it will mask the man. Now I've made a mistake here because I've done it round the wrong way. No problem. If that happens, just pick up your mask or just select your mask, hit Ctrl-I to invert. There's our man floating on a transparent background. Looking back, I'm not sure why I decided to inverse that selection. We could have just worked with the selection of the man, but in that case, of course, what we would have done, rather than expanding the selection, we would have contracted it 2 pixels. It amounts to the same thing. The beauty we have here, though, we've got a nice cutout made. Let's have a look around the edge. I think it's going to be pretty good, especially when we put it against the new image. But we still have our smart object, and we've got it saved. So I'm going to double click my smart object to open it back up into Camera Raw because we are making a monochrome image. Now I've already tackled the chromatic aberration, so I'll just knock off the vibrance and I'll take the saturation. And already the guy is looking a nice sparkling monochrome, but let's see if we can improve on that with the clarity. Yeah, that's looking pretty good, isn't it? He's going to jump off the page, I hope. And maybe even a little bit of blacks, a little bit of whites. I don't want to burn anything out, so I'm just going to, well, that's already checked. I didn't realize that was checked already, but I was going to say to make sure we don't burn anything out, but we've actually got a long way to go before we start to do that. So certainly that's going to be a pretty dramatic center of interest to our new image. I don't think I need to do anything else now. I'm going to open this back up into Photoshop. Everything we've done here is changeable. We still have our mask, we still have our smart object. So what I've done so far, I could just hit Ctrl-S to save over the top of my project 1, because what I need next is my second image. Now I don't think it matters which one of these images I choose, but looking at the two, for reasons I can't really explain, I think this one's slightly better. It's got a smaller area of white here, which we can just get rid of anyway, but this line here seems to be a little bit more attractive than this one going off the edge, but I think both of them would be usable. So I'm going to double click and open that up into Camera Raw. Same thing here. Fix the chromatic aberration, go back to the basic tab and take the saturation off. Now what I'd like to do here is to use the graphic shapes here to help form our image. So I want contrast and clarity here too, but I think we have to be a bit careful that we don't add so much contrast and clarity that in the end we compete with the guy who's the center of interest. But of course we do have the blur controls in Photoshop which we may need to use. So what I'm going to do, I think, is to the usual thing. Let's take a look at some clarity. Looking up at the histogram, all looks pretty good, but maybe a little blacks, a little white, but not too much else. You can see I'm burning out a little bit on the bottom corner there. Maybe I'll drop the exposure down a little bit. Maybe increase the contrast. Remember, we're going to keep this as a smart object for as long as we can, so we can always come back in and adjust it should the need arise. There is one other thing we can do. We could adjust the scale of this image. Now this scale tool has changed position just recently. In June 2016 we now have these options here on the top bar where they used to be grouped with the chromatic aberration, and the one I'm thinking of is the scale here. Now although I said I liked this upright, I may be losing it now. So I'm going to move that slider to the right, and you can see what's going to happen. I get rid of that highlight on the bottom. I think that looks marginally better. I get rid of the distraction on the bottom as well. I'm going to open this up and we'll move forward as the image is. Bit light on the right hand side, but I think we need to view this as a smart object with our silver man in place so that we can see where we need to go next. As soon as the image appears on screen, I'm going to switch back to my silver man and drag him out. With the move tool selected from the toolbox, I'm going to click, drag and drop. Once the man's in place, I can remove this from the screen because we've already got it saved, and I can bring this guy up to the position we want him, and now we can start to make a decision. First thing I think I want to do is flip him over. Either that or I need to flip the background, but I think we'll flip the man because everything's leaning to the right. He needs to be moving to the right or looking to the right. Let me hit Ctrl 0 to fit the image on screen. I do like to have my image as big as possible all of the time. You can see now how the cutout looks pretty good against the background. There's two ways to flip an image. You can flip the whole project using the rotation tools, so image rotation, flip horizontal or vertical, but if we do that it will flip both the man and the background. The way we want to work is via the edit menu, transform, and we're going to flip horizontal, but here, as you see, it only flips the layer we had selected. So now I can position this guy. If I need any help, I can pick up my crop tool and just click into the picture. I've got a square shape here, so I need to go back to a standard shape. So you can see the composition here is pretty good. Up the third line and the head is where those two lines cross. We could move him a fraction to the right, but I think that's a small point. But we can do so if we wish, but we've got virtually classic composition here. Now we have moved on quite a bit, so it's well worth saving this as a second project, and I've done that giving it a 002 label at the end of the file name. If we go to the layers though, everything that we've created so far is still all within our control. Both of the images are smart objects, and we have a mask which is controlling the cutout. Little tip, if we want to turn off the mask for any reason, hold the shift key and click it, and if we needed proof that masking doesn't remove pixels, there they are. Turn it back on, just click the mask, and sometimes it can be quite useful at times to work directly on the mask. Alt and click the mask, and there it is. So if you see any little splodges around here which may have been missed, then it's quite possible. It happens from time to time. Looking down there, I think I can see a couple. Look at that. So if they were critical to our work, we would pick up a soft edge brush, white, and we would just paint these out because we can paint directly onto the mask. So they're little bits of the selection which I obviously must have missed, but not significant in this particular piece of work, but they could be in others, so a useful tip to know. Now we need to turn our attention to that background because as nice as it is competing with the guy a fair amount. So what I want to do is to soften this, and I'm going to try the blur tools, and I'm going to leave this as a smart object. What I'd like to do here is to go to my filters menu and the blur options. Now the one I would have liked to have used is lens blur, but you'll notice it's greyed out. It's greyed out because we're working on a smart object. So we've got two choices. We can switch to one of the other blur options, or we can go to the layers, make a copy of our smart object, and then take away the smart object status of that layer by rasterizing it, and then the lens blur will work. Let's try the Gaussian blur to start with. At least it'll give us a feel for how well we're doing. Now it's picked up an enormous blur from the last time I used it, obviously. And straight away it's showing us we've got a bit of a problem here. We've got a line going down the screen. Now that's not uncommon. What's happened here, this is the edge of the frame of our man, and it's just picked up a little problem with the mask that we've made. So just for a second I'll leave that blur way heavier than I really want. We'll go to the layers menu. We'll select our layer mask for the cutout. I need to have black as my foreground colour. Practically any brush will do, but I'm using just a standard soft edge brush. The opacity and flow at 100%. I'm going to click at the top, and you can either paint down or use a shift tool or the shift click method. Hit the shift key and click at the bottom, and I've effectively painted from top to bottom. So it's a little anomaly that you may see from time to time, easy to get rid of, but it proves we need to look for these things. So back to our layers and our smart object, and of course it looks a bit odd, doesn't it, because the Gaussian blur we've applied is now a smart object, the same as the layer. So I can double click and be straight back into my Gaussian blur, and I can change this as many times as I wish without losing quality. Now, how much blur do we want to put into the background? Well, I think that's the $64,000 question. I think sometimes we're all going to choose something a little different, and because we're working with a smart object here, we can change it as many times as we wish. So I'm going to pick that for a moment and click OK. I said earlier on, I think I said, that I'm not sure if I wanted the blur over the entire background. Well, maybe we can have a few experiments and see what we can do with a graduated filter or the graduated tool on the layer mask here. Because we're working with a smart object, we're given a layer mask. So I'm going to select the mask, and you'll see it frame up. I'm going to go to my toolbox. I've got black as my foreground colour. I'm going to pick up my gradient tool. The options I'm using are the linear gradient, which is the one on the far left, and here foreground to transparent, which is this one here. Now what I was thinking of here was to place my cursor down at the bottom corner somewhere and draw a line maybe up the page so that I mask the softness from the bottom corner to the top. Now this is going to need a bit of trial and error. I think I've gone a bit too far with that, so Control Z will undo. I'm going to come up slightly less, maybe a little bit from the bottom here to match it, not too far, but you can see the sort of thing I've done. Whether that's going to work better with that different type of blur, probably not a great deal of difference. Have I blurred the background here a little too much? Well, we've got the best of all worlds here, haven't we? Because if we go back into layers, we can go back into that Gaussian blur. Now we've got it masked. Now we can have a little bit of an experiment. We can tuck these away. Let's clear that away from the picture surface. We'll stick this down at the bottom, and we can start to have a look around and see what we want. So it needs to be up there somewhere. If I go up there, it's massively too much. That's looking a little bit too computerized for me, so it needs to be a bit more delicate. So I'm sort of more or less finding my way to the blur that I want, and it looks to be around 9 or 10 pixels. Now before I actually move forward with this, I would like to try one or two other options. I'm going to hold Control, Alt and the space bar. Just click once into the picture. You can see it brings up the zoom in, the minus option. Because I'm going to go back to my layers, make sure my mask is selected. I'm going to flood the mask with white. White is my background colour, so Control Backspace will do that. So what I've done is I've removed any traces of the mask because I want to try some different options. How would it look if I did it from the top down? Doesn't make a lot of sense to do that, but I like to try these things because you never know what you may discover. Not sure about that because being sharp on that side, I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that. maybe if I just come in this way. So we've got the guy against the soft background here, but it's moving sharp here. Well, I think there's 101 different ways we can work here. Let's just try one up from the bottom. I think that works pretty well. I'm going to live with that for a moment because this is one of those things that you could just carry on and on and on with. Control 0 will fit the image on screen. What I'd like to do next is to open up that background back into Camera Raw. One of the things I always do with pictures is to give them a bit of a vignette to force the attention onto the main subject, and I think here we can do that pretty well. So I'm going to go back into Layers. I'm going to select my background. I'm going to double click. Opens up into Camera Raw. I can pick up my circular filter or radial filter. I'm going to guess where the guy is because I can't see him at the moment, but we know more or less where he is, don't we? He's about there. Once I've done that, I can right click and reset the local selections and hit the V key to hide the selection. So now I can see exactly what I'm doing because I want to darken it down on the edge. I'm going to drop down and adjust my feather. See if I can make, there's the vignette. I want to make it a bit more pronounced. Maybe I'll bring the selection back because after doing that I think I may want to just draw it out a little bit. If you want to make it longer and thinner, of course, you can just drop the size of the image down and you can do something like that. But what I want to do is to give it a fairly healthy burning in of the edge. Let's give that a try. Remember, we've got a smart object here. Everything we've done is changeable right back to the starting image that we began with. Click OK and we'll allow that to open up into Photoshop. Now, as soon as I've seen that pop on screen, I realise that I don't like that, and I think the darkness that I've got on the background edges needs to be across the whole thing. Well, we can fix that pretty easily. Let's double click our smart object and open it back up. Let me pick up my radial filter, click the pin to liven the pin up, hit the delete key to remove it. Now I need to move back to my basic tab. I can do that by clicking one of these icons up here, but I usually just touch the H for the hand tool because now I'm going to change tack. Now I've seen it, I want to bring that down. I want to make it a bit darker. Maybe we'll strengthen the blacks, and then perhaps I'll put a radial filter on that and we'll darken the edges considerably. Now we can see the sort of darkening we're getting there. If I just double click my exposure, you can see the difference that that's made. I'm going to try that and I'm going to click to open that. As soon as it opens, we'll know if we've got it more or less right. It just makes him stand out beautifully, doesn't it? Now I'm asking myself, does the background need to be blurred more or less? Well, I think that's more of a personal decision rather than a definite right or wrong. At the moment, I think the background is balancing reasonably well with the guy, but the guy maybe looks even a little bit light now. So we've got control there too, because he is still a smart object too. So let's open him back up into Adobe Camera Raw, and I'm going to drop the exposure down a bit on him to give all of those tones a bit more richness. And I can do this as many times as I wish without any risk to the quality. See what I mean? Once you start to see the two aspects, you can start to get closer to that very natural balance. Now I've just spent a couple of minutes sitting looking at the image, and there's a couple of options that we can try. There's a little bit of a distraction down in the extreme bottom right corner, very easy to put right, but I'm not entirely happy with the guy's face. Now it's gone a little bit too dark in comparison to the rest, and also I think this gloved hand and this arm is quite important. So I think what I may do as a little final manipulation is to go back into my Adobe Camera Raw, zoom into the guy's head. That should do us. I'm going to pick up my adjustment brush. I just want to brush over there and then adjust the exposure a little bit. You can see what I'm doing. Now I can add to that. You can see the tones just coming up a little bit, just making his face a little bit more dominant. And I think down here maybe I'll go and add a new adjustment brush for that. Let's push the shadows up a little bit here, the exposure a bit. It's just this little area around here. Now I need to be a bit careful here, but I'm conscious that we've already spent a fair time on this manipulation, so I think you're getting the drift of what I'm doing here and why. I'm trying to emphasize what I think is good about the picture while subduing and getting rid of some of the things I don't. But that I think will meet my needs. Let's try by clicking OK. One of the problems we can have when we apply a blur to a background, depending on how much blur we apply, let's see if I can show this by zooming in super large here. That's a little too far, bear with me. Okay, I think this will do it. What we're looking at here is the photographic subject of the guy's head, and we can start to see the actual pixels that form the image. Whereas on the blurred background we can't, because of the nature of the blur. What it's done, it's smoothed it out, and now it looks a little too computer-like. So I think we've reached a point where I want to start adding a little noise into the background. Now if I select my background here, ignore that, and go to my filters menu and choose noise, add noise, I'm going to add 1% of Gaussian monochrome noise. Look at the difference that makes. Now although you're looking at this with a slightly compressed video, I hope you can see the difference there, but looking at this on screen without any of that video compression, that is just about a perfect balance between the two. So I'm going to accept that and Control 0. And after working with the image for some time, we did a little bit of work down here on the mask. But now I'm just wondering whether I want the mask at all. So I'll leave it there for the moment and I'll just turn it off, because the softness seems to be working pretty well. But I do need to do something down at the bottom here. I'm not going to be able to clone on there because it's a smart object. I could just darken it down a little bit later on, but I think I'm more or less at the point where I'm ready to save this as a layered file and then move on from here. Now there always comes a time with a piece of work like this where we do need to draw it to a close, and I think we're close to that here. But one last thing I'd like to try. I'd like to try to increase the width a little bit, just a touch. Now to do that I'm going to need to remove the smart object status of that layer, and it means I've got to commit my mask. Well, I've turned my mask off. I think I'm happy to live with that. So I'm going to go to the right of that smart object, right click and choose rasterize. I'm going to go to my image menu, choose canvas size, anchor my picture to the left, and looking at this in inches, I'm going to add about 3 inches to the width. And you'll see it's appearing on the right as a transparent area. Then if I go back to my edit menu, transform, and I just want my free transform, I'm just going to drag this out a little bit and hit the enter key. Now just before I commit a crop here, I just want to have a look where the guy is in relation to that. See, we need to move the guy maybe just a shade to the right. We could argue whether we need to. I'm going to assume we do. So I'm just going to pick up the guy for a moment, pick up my move tool, and I can just move him very slightly to the right. Then I can go back to my crop, and I've just added a bit of shape to that. I think I'm going to hit the enter key. I've left a little tiny slither there, so I need to do that again. Didn't get that quite right. Just come in a little bit, and there we have it. Almost lost that little spot down at the bottom right, but not quite. So while we've got that in our mind, let's select the bottom layer, which is our background. Let's pick up our spot healing brush, and let's get that dealt with before we forget. Not doing too well, so let me pick up my brush. I've got black here. I'm going to drop my flow rate down to about 5%. I'll just paint the thing out, no problem with that at all. Now I've just saved version 3 of this particular work, so I'm going to go to my layers now and flatten to finish. So here we have my very unfair comparison between the untouched raw file of the guy and the image we've created, and it certainly is an aggressive black and white, and an improvement, I think, or I hope, on the original.